Today's gospel passage from the 9th chapter of Mark's gospel, like last Sunday's from the 8th chapter, and another passage from the 10th chapter, which we'll hear in about 4 weeks' time, they all share a common pattern, a pattern of 3 parts. That pattern, of course, involves Jesus and his disciples. The first part begins with Jesus predicting his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. The next part of this pattern is that the disciples do not understand Jesus' straightforward prediction. And finally, the pattern concludes with some sort of additional teaching, adjustment to the disciples' understanding both of what would be happening to Jesus and the implications for that on what it means to be a disciple. So in today's version of that very important teaching, an important teaching because Mark repeats it 3 times, we read Jesus say, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." Now, while you'll agree this statement lacks detail, it certainly provides a pretty clear and concise summary of what will take place. What happens to Jesus is a vital part of what his followers, what you and I, must learn and understand. Now, to that very straightforward statement about what's going to happen, we hear Peter respond last week by saying, "No, that can't be right." Well, in today's passage, we get a very different response. We hear that the disciples do not understand what he was saying, and that they're afraid to ask him. Begs the question, why were they afraid to ask this, their teacher? This one whom they've committed themselves to being disciples to. Was it because they were afraid to face the truth? They were in denial that someday they would lose their loving teacher? That he would suffer and he'd die? Was it because it was too uncomfortable for them to have their worldview, their understanding of the Messiah, their understanding even of God, God's self, so radically changed by the Son of God suffering and dying? Maybe they were just afraid, like so many of us have been as students in situations where we don't want to ask the question and look stupid. Why might we find it difficult to understand that the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands and killed and rise again? The rational part of me thinks, what a bizarre way for God to reconcile the world to himself. Why might we be afraid to admit our lack of understanding? Some soul-searching work here, but important work, because it will aid us in continuing to grow as disciples. And of course, we can have hope in growing because we have a brilliant and observant teacher in Jesus who wants his disciples to learn this lesson. I think it's why it's repeated 3 times in Mark's gospel, this important lesson. Jesus wants his disciples to succeed, to grow, to understand the important truth. And like a brilliant teacher, very observant of his pupils, he takes their very own behavior along the way to provide a teaching moment. What were you arguing about on the way? Jesus asks them. But they're silent. They don't respond. For on the way they were arguing with one another about which of them was the greatest. That behavior, we can see, indicates that the disciples were still very much attached to and following the patterns of their world, of their society. They were jockeying for honor, for position, to be the highest, the greatest among them. Even among their peers, they were looking for advancing themselves. Their actions clearly showed that they did not understand, that they'd not taken into themselves yet Jesus' teachings. Goodness knows oftentimes our behaviors indicate that we haven't yet understood Jesus' teaching, his pattern of life, death, and resurrection. And if we don't recognize it ourselves, others are quite willing to say, to point out the hypocrisy of so many who call themselves disciples of Jesus. It's a tough thing to hear. But again, it serves that important purpose of drawing us in to realize we must continue to learn and to grow. And wanting his disciples to understand, to meet them where they were at in their frailties, he offers them an object lesson. He calls the 12 together. Whoever wants to be first must be last and a servant of all. This is completely opposite to what the disciples were seeking in their question about who's the greatest. Then he demonstrates, he takes this little child and puts it among the disciples and takes it in his arms and says to them, whoever welcomes me, or whoever welcomes one such child in my name, welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but God, the very one who sent me. Now, this is strange to us, where we dote on our children. But in Jesus' day, little children were viewed as nothing more than property, referred to as it. So Jesus demonstrates the role of a servant to all by even including one who was below the servants. In time, we know that disciples came to understand. By God's grace and by their persistence, continuing to follow him, continuing to learn from him, they too became servants of all. In fact, they were servants of us in ensuring that we would be exposed to God, to Jesus' teachings, to his life, death, and resurrection. They spent their lives so that we might come to learn from Jesus. We follow their example and his. In the Mass, we often find ourselves referred to as God's humble servants. And in the Eucharistic prayer, that great Thanksgiving prayer, we rehearse Jesus' pattern, his passion, his death and resurrection. In so doing, like the first disciples, we can learn from Jesus' example. And we do so too by following the examples of those disciples. And boy, can we take some hope from them. The ones that just don't get it, and still don't get it, and still don't get it. And yet, God and Jesus are so faithful and continue to bring them along, so that they move from dullness and understanding to being men and women who bring transformation to the world through Jesus. May we too find the grace and the persistence of the disciples, that we too might be made holy and examples for others to follow. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.